The summer heat of 1887 pressed down on the dusty streets of Copper Creek like a heavy blanket, making even the hardiest souls seek shade beneath the wooden overhangs of the frontier town's weathered buildings. The saloon doors of Murphy's Den swung lazily in the stifling air, their hinges creaking with each gentle breeze that managed to find its way through the narrow alleyways between the ramshackle structures that lined Main Street. Inside the dim interior of the saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the acrid smell of cheap whiskey. Brass spittoons caught the amber streams from the mouths of weathered cowboys and drifters who had wandered into town seeking refuge from the merciless sun, and perhaps a game of cards to pass the brutal afternoon hours. The floorboards groaned under heavy boots, their surfaces worn smooth by years of hard living and harder drinking. Eliza May Harrison pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the storage room behind the bar, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. Through the thin planks, she could hear every word of the conversation taking place in Murphy's office, each syllable driving another nail into the coffin of her already bleak existence. "You owe me $300, Harrison." Murphy's gravelly voice cut through the stale air like a rusty blade. 3 months I've been patient with you, watching you drink away what little sense the good Lord gave you. But my patience has limits, and you've reached them. Eliza May closed her eyes and bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from making a sound. She knew exactly what her stepfather owed Murphy, and she knew why. Every night for the past year, since her mother had died from the fever that swept through town, Jonas Harrison had stumbled through their cabin door reeking of rot-gut whiskey and defeat. Every morning, he would disappear into town, leaving her to tend to their small plot of land and the few scrawny chickens that somehow managed to survive despite his neglect. "I know what I owe." Jonas's voice was thick with alcohol and something that might have been shame if he'd had any left to spare. "But I ain't got it. Lost my last $20 to that card shop from Denver last week." Murphy's chair creaked as he leaned back, the sound ominous in the heavy silence that followed. Eliza May could picture him perfectly, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and eyes that held no warmth, no mercy. She had seen him throw men twice her size out into the street without breaking a sweat. "Well now," Murphy said slowly, his voice taking on a tone that made Eliza May's blood turn to ice water in her veins. "That does present us with a problem, doesn't it? See, I'm not in the business of charity, never have been, never will be. But I am in the business of collecting what's owed to me one way or another." "What are you getting at?" Jonas asked, though there was a tremor in his voice that suggested he already suspected where this conversation was heading. "Your stepdaughter," Murphy said simply. "Pretty little thing from what I hear. 17, ain't she? Prime age for certain types of work." The words hit Eliza May like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping silently against the wall. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tasting blood where her teeth had cut into her lip. "Now hold on just a minute," Jonas began. But his protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "Hold on nothing," Murphy cut him off. "You've got a choice to make, Harrison. Your debt or your stepdaughter. I know plenty of men who'd pay good money for a fresh face like hers. Course, once she's working for me, there ain't no going back to that life you've been living. But that's your choice to make." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on for eternity. Eliza May found herself holding her breath, praying to whatever divine power might be listening that her stepfather would find some backbone, some shred of decency buried beneath all that whiskey and self-pity. But deep in her heart, she already knew what his answer would be. "She ain't my blood," Jonas finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her mama married me when the girl was 15. I never did take to her much." "Is that a yes?" Murphy's voice carried a note of satisfaction that made Eliza May's skin crawl. God forgive me, yes." The sound that escaped Eliza May's throat was barely human, a wounded animal's cry of pain and betrayal that she managed to muffle with both hands pressed against her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she slid down the wall until she was crouched on the floor, her whole body shaking with the magnitude of what had just transpired. Smart man, Murphy said. I'll send someone around to collect her tomorrow morning. Have her ready. What if she runs? Jonas asked. Murphy's laugh was like gravel scraping against stone. Where's she gonna run to? This is the frontier, Harrison. Girl like that, alone out there? She'd be dead or worse inside of a week. No, she'll come quiet-like, or I'll make sure she comes anyway. Eliza May heard chairs scraping against the floor and knew the meeting was ending. She scrambled to her feet and pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the storage room, watching through a crack in the wall as Jonas stumbled past, his face pale and his hands shaking. He didn't even glance in her direction. She waited until she heard the saloon doors swing shut behind him before she dared to breathe again. Through the thin wall, she could hear Murphy moving around his office, the clink of glass suggesting he was celebrating his latest acquisition with a drink. The walk home through the dusty streets felt like a death march. Eliza May kept her head down, her bonnet pulled low to hide her tear-stained face from the curious stares of the townspeople who had known her since she was a child. Mrs. Patterson at the general store called out a greeting, but Eliza May pretended not to hear. How could she face these people, knowing what they would think of her tomorrow when word got around about what Jonas had done? Their cabin sat at the edge of town, a modest structure that her real father had built with his own hands before he died in a mining accident when she was just 12 years old. Her mother had married Jonas 2 years later, more out of desperation than love, needing someone to help work the land and provide for her daughter. It had never been a happy arrangement, but her mother had made the best of it, and Eliza May had tried to do the same. Now, standing in the doorway of the place she had called home for the past 5 years, she wondered if she would ever see it again after tomorrow morning. Jonas was sitting at their small kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey already half empty in front of him. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. For a moment, she considered confronting him, demanding to know how he could sell her like a piece of livestock to pay off his gambling debts. But what was the point? The deed was done. The bargain struck. I heard, she said simply, setting down the basket of eggs she had collected from their chickens earlier that morning. It felt like a lifetime ago. Jonas flinched as if she had struck him, but still didn't meet her eyes. It's for the best, he mumbled into his whiskey glass. You're a grown woman now. Time you made your own way in the world. By working in Murphy's brothel? The words came out sharper than she had intended, cutting through the cabin's stifling air like a blade. You don't know what you're talking about, Jonas said, but his voice lacked conviction. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Eliza May replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside her chest. I know what kind of business Murphy runs upstairs from that saloon. I know what happens to the girls who work for him, and I know that you just sold me to him like a horse at auction. Jonas finally looked up at her then, his bloodshot eyes filled with something that might have been regret if she had been feeling generous enough to give him credit for such a human emotion. But Eliza May was feeling anything but generous. What choice did I have? He asked plaintively. He would have killed me or worse. At least this way you'll have a roof over your head and food to eat. Food to eat, Eliza May repeated slowly, tasting the bitter irony of the words. Yes, I'm sure that's exactly what you were thinking about when you agreed to let him turn me into a whore. The slap came without warning, Jonas's open palm catching her across the cheek with enough force to send her stumbling backward. The sharp crack of flesh against flesh seemed to echo in the small cabin, followed by a silence so profound that Eliza May could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Don't you dare use that word in this house, Jonas said, his face flushed red with whiskey and anger. Your mama raised you better than that. My mama raised me to be decent, Eliza May shot back, her hand pressed to her burning cheek. But she's dead, and you killed any decency left in this house the moment you shook hands with Murphy. Jonas raised his hand again, but something in Eliza May's eyes must have given him pause because he slowly lowered it to his side. They stared at each other across the small space of the cabin, two people who had never really been family, now reduced to something even less than strangers. Pack your things. Jonas said finally, turning back to his bottle. "Murphy's sending someone for you at first light." Eliza May didn't respond. She simply turned and walked toward the small room that had been hers since she was 15, closing the door behind her with careful deliberation. The lock was broken, had been for years, but she turned the handle anyway, a symbolic gesture that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Her belongings didn't amount to much. A few dresses that her mother had sewn for her, some undergarments that had seen better days, a pair of boots that were worn thin but still functional, and a small wooden box that contained her most precious possessions, a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, a lock of her mother's hair, and a letter her real father had written to her before he died, telling her how proud he was of the young woman she was becoming. She held the letter in her hands now, reading the faded words by candlelight, trying to draw some strength from the love that had once surrounded her like a warm blanket. Her father had been a good man, stern but fair, hard-working and honest. He would have died before he let anyone hurt his daughter, would have moved heaven and earth to protect her from the fate that now awaited her. But her father was dead, and her mother was dead, and she was alone in the world with no one to protect her from the wolves. The sound of Jonas's drunken snoring eventually filled the cabin, but sleep eluded Eliza May entirely. She sat by her small window, watching the stars wheel slowly across the desert sky, trying to imagine what her life would be like tomorrow, next week, next year. The images that came to her mind were dark ones, filled with rough hands and leering faces, and the kind of degradation that she had heard whispered about in hushed tones by the married women in town. As the first pale fingers of dawn began to creep across the horizon, she heard the sound of horses approaching. Her time had run out. 3 men dismounted outside their cabin, their boots heavy on the packed earth of the yard. Eliza May recognized Murphy's voice immediately, along with 2 others she didn't know. She heard Jonas stumble to the door, probably still half drunk from the night before. "She ready?" Murphy asked without preamble. "Ready as she'll ever be," Jonas replied, his voice hollow. "Good, bring her out." There was a moment of silence, then Jonas's footsteps approaching her door. He knocked once, softly. "Eliza May, time to go." She stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting in the same position for hours. With shaking hands, she tied her bonnet under her chin and picked up the small cloth bag that contained her few possessions. At the last moment, she grabbed her mother's shawl from where it hung on a peg by the door, a small piece of comfort to take with her into the unknown. Jonas was waiting in the main room, his eyes red-rimmed and his face pale. He wouldn't meet her gaze, wouldn't even look at her directly. For a moment she thought he might say something, an apology perhaps, or some word of comfort, but he simply gestured toward the door and stepped aside to let her pass. Murphy was waiting outside with 2 other men she didn't recognize. One was short and stocky, with a face like a ferret, the other tall and thin with cold eyes that seemed to look right through her. Both were armed, she noticed, their hands resting casually on the grips of their revolvers. "There she is," Murphy said, looking her up and down like a horse trader evaluating livestock. "Pretty as a picture, just like I heard." Eliza May lifted her chin and met his gaze directly, refusing to let him see her fear. She had made a decision during the long night of waiting. She would not go to her fate like a lamb to slaughter. She would maintain what dignity she could, for her own sake and for the memory of her parents. "Oh, where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Murphy grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Why, back to town, of course. Got a room all ready for you above the saloon. Real nice place. You'll like it there." The lie was so blatant, so insulting, that Eliza May almost laughed. Instead, she simply nodded and began walking toward the horses they had brought for her. Behind her, she heard the cabin door close with a soft click, the sound final as a coffin lid. She didn't look back. The ride into town was conducted in silence, Murphy and his men flanking her on either side, as if she were a dangerous criminal rather than a 17-year-old girl with nowhere to run. The morning sun was already beginning to beat down mercilessly, promising another day of crushing heat that would drive most sensible people indoors until evening. As they approached the main street of Copper Creek, Eliza May noticed that the usual bustle of morning activity was strangely muted. A few shopkeepers were opening their establishments, but most of the townspeople seemed to be staying inside, their windows shuttered against more than just the sun. Word had already begun to spread, she realized. Everyone knew what Jonas had done, and they were ashamed to witness the result of his cowardice. Murphy's den looked different in the harsh light of day, smaller somehow, more sordid. The paint was peeling from its weathered walls, and the windows were grimy with dust and neglect. A hand-painted sign above the door advertised cold beer and hot food, but everyone in town knew that wasn't the establishment's primary source of revenue. "Welcome home," Murphy said with false cheer as they dismounted in front of the saloon. "Come on, let me show you around." The interior of the saloon was empty, except for a few die-hard drunks who probably hadn't left since the night before. The air was stale with the smell of tobacco and unwashed bodies, and the floorboards were sticky with spilled liquor. Murphy led her behind the bar to a narrow staircase that disappeared into the darkness of the second floor. "Your room's up here," he said, gesturing for her to precede him up the stairs. Real private-like. The second floor was a narrow hallway lined with doors, most of them closed. From behind one of them, Eliza May could hear the sound of a woman crying softly. Another door stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of an unmade bed and a woman sitting on its edge, staring listlessly out a small window. Murphy stopped in front of a door near the end of the hall and produced a large iron key from his pocket. "This one's yours," he said, unlocking the door and pushing it open. "Go on, take a look." The room was small and cramped, with barely enough space for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. The walls were thin planks of unpainted wood, and the only window was so small and dirty that it let in almost no light. A thin mattress covered with questionable stains lay on the bed frame, and the air smelled of things that Eliza May didn't want to identify. "It ain't the Ritz," Murphy said, apparently taking her stunned silence for approval, "but it's got everything you need. You'll take your meals downstairs with the other girls, and I expect you to be ready for work by 8 o'clock every evening. Sundays are your day off, less when we get busy." Eliza May set down her small bag on the chair and turned to face him. "What if I refuse?" Murphy's genial mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the predator beneath. "Then you'll find out just how unpleasant I can make your life, sweetheart. But I don't think it'll come to that. You seem like a smart girl, and smart girls know when they ain't got no choice in the matter." He stepped closer, and Eliza May caught the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed flesh. "Besides," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "where you gonna go? You got no money, no family, no friends willing to help you. This is your life now. Might as well make the best of it." After he left, locking the door behind him, Eliza May sank onto the edge of the filthy mattress and allowed herself to cry for the first time since she had overheard the conversation that had changed everything. The tears came in great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body, releasing all the fear and anger and despair that she had been holding inside since the previous afternoon. But eventually, the tears stopped flowing, and she wiped her eyes with her mother's shawl. Crying wouldn't change anything. She needed to think, to plan, to find some way out of this nightmare before it was too late. The sound of horses in the street below drew her to the tiny window. Through the grime-covered glass, she could see several riders approaching the saloon. One of them caught her attention immediately, a tall man in a dark hat riding a magnificent black stallion. Even from this distance, there was something different about him, something that set him apart from the usual riffraff that frequented Murphy's den. As she watched, the man dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post in front of the saloon. He moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, confident but not arrogant. When he removed his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow, she caught a glimpse of dark hair and a face that was weathered by sun and wind, but still handsome in a rugged, masculine way. Something about the stranger stirred a feeling in Eliza May that she couldn't quite identify. Hope, perhaps, though she couldn't have said why. He was probably just another customer, another man looking for the kind of entertainment that Murphy provided. But there had been something in the way he carried himself, something that suggested he was different from the others. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her door interrupted her observations. Someone was coming, and from the heavy tread, she could tell it was Murphy. She moved quickly away from the window and smoothed down her skirts, trying to compose herself for whatever fresh horror awaited her. The key turned in the lock, and Murphy's bulk filled the doorway. Behind him stood one of the women she had glimpsed earlier, a tired-looking blonde who couldn't have been much older than herself, but whose eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone who had given up all hope long ago. "This here's Sally," Murphy said, pushing the woman forward. "She's gonna show you the ropes, teach you what you need to know. Sally, this is our new girl, Eliza May." Sally looked her up and down with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to size up potential threats quickly. "Pretty," she said simply. "That'll work in your favor, at least at first. Men like fresh faces." "I'll leave you two to get acquainted," Murphy said, backing out of the room. "Remember Eliza May, 8 o'clock sharp. Don't make me come looking for you." The door closed behind him, but this time he didn't lock it. Sally moved to the single chair and sat down heavily, as if the simple act of walking down the hallway had exhausted her. "How long have you been here?" Eliza May asked, settling back onto the edge of the bed. 2 years, Sally replied. "Came here from Kansas when my husband died in a farming accident. Didn't have no place else to go, no family to take me in. Murphy offered me a job and a place to stay, and I was fool enough to think it was legitimate work." "What's it like?" Eliza May asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Sally was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with a sadness so profound that it took Eliza May's breath away. "It's exactly what you think it is," she said softly, "and worse than you can imagine. The men, they ain't gentle. They don't care if they hurt you, long as they get what they paid for. And Murphy, he takes most of what they pay, claims it's for room and board. By the time you buy the things you need, soap, clothes, medicine when you get sick, there ain't nothing left to save up. Has anyone ever tried to leave? A few. Most don't make it very far before Murphy's men bring them back, and when they do," Sally shuddered. "Let's just say Murphy don't appreciate employees who try to break their contracts." Disdain, the hopelessness in Sally's voice was like a weight pressing down on Eliza May's chest, making it hard to breathe. Was this really her future? Was she destined to spend the rest of her life in this squalid room, servicing men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold? A commotion in the street below interrupted her dark thoughts. Through the thin walls, she could hear raised voices from the saloon's main room. Sally's head came up sharply, her eyes alert. "That's strange," she said, moving to the window. "Murphy don't usually allow arguments in his place. Bad for business." Eliza May joined her at the window, trying to see what was happening in the street below. The mysterious dark-haired stranger's horse was still tied to the hitching post, which meant he was still inside the saloon. Whatever was happening down there seemed to involve him. "Think we should go see what's going on?" Eliza May asked. Sally shook her head quickly. "Murphy don't like us mingling with the customers before working hours. If he caught us downstairs now..." She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. The voices below grew louder, and suddenly they heard the distinctive sound of a chair being overturned. Sally grabbed Eliza May's arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "I ain't never heard Murphy sound scared before, but that's what he sounds like now." Through the floorboards, they could hear Murphy's voice, higher pitched than usual and tinged with something that might have been panic. "Now hold on there, mister. We can work this out like civilized men." "I don't think you understand," came the reply in a deep, calm voice that somehow carried more menace than Murphy's usual bluster. "I'm not here to negotiate." Sally and Eliza May exchanged glances. Whatever was happening downstairs, it was unlike anything that normally occurred in Murphy's den. The stranger's voice had an authority to it, a quiet confidence that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. "Look," Murphy said, and they could hear him moving around, probably backing away from whatever threat the stranger represented. "If this is about money, we can work something out. I'm a reasonable man." "This isn't about money," the stranger replied. "This is about doing what's right." There was a long silence, then the sound of boots crossing the floor. When the stranger spoke again, his voice was closer to the stairs, and Eliza May felt her heart begin to race for reasons she couldn't explain. "I'll be back tomorrow," the stranger said. "Have everything ready." The saloon doors swung open and closed, and through the window Eliza May watched as the dark-haired man emerged into the street. He moved with the same fluid grace she had noticed before, untying his horse's reins with economical movements. Before mounting, he looked up at the second-floor windows of the saloon, and for just a moment, Eliza May could have sworn his eyes met hers through the grimy glass. Then he was gone, riding out of town at a steady canter that raised a small cloud of dust in the still air. "Who do you think he was?" Eliza May asked, but Sally had already moved away from the window, her face pale. "I don't know," Sally replied, "but I ain't never seen Murphy look scared like that. Whoever that man is, he's got some kind of power over Murphy, and that's something I thought I'd never see." The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Sally showed her the small communal room where the women took their meals, introduced her to the other girls who worked for Murphy, and explained the brutal realities of life in the brothel. There were 6 other women in total, ranging in age from barely 18 to a weathered prostitute named Mabel, who claimed to be 28 but looked at least 10 years older. Each had a story not unlike Eliza May's own: desperate circumstances, limited choices, and the gradual erosion of hope that came with daily degradation. They were friendly enough in their way, but there was an undercurrent of competition among them, a recognition that in their world, every woman was ultimately alone. As evening approached and 8 o'clock drew near, Eliza May felt her courage begin to falter. The reality of what was expected of her crashed down like a physical weight, and she found herself struggling to breathe. Sally, perhaps recognizing the signs of panic, took her aside. "Listen to me," she said urgently. "I know this is hard, harder than anything you ever imagined. But you got to survive this, you understand? Whatever happens tonight, tomorrow, next week, you got to keep some part of yourself separate from it all. That's the only way to make it through." "I don't know if I can," Eliza May whispered. "You can," Sally insisted. "You're stronger than you know. I can see it in you. Just remember, this ain't who you are, it's just what you're doing to survive. There's a difference, and if you hold on to that difference, you might just make it out of here someday." At 5 minutes before 8, Murphy's heavy footsteps could be heard climbing the stairs. Eliza May's hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't button her dress properly, and Sally had to help her with the fastenings. "Remember what I told you," Sally whispered, as Murphy's knock echoed through the thin door. "Hold on to yourself." The door opened, and Murphy's bulk filled the frame. Behind him, she could see several men waiting in the hallway, customers who had come for the evening's entertainment. Her stomach churned as she imagined what the next few hours would bring. "Time to earn your keep," Murphy said, his voice once again carrying that false joviality that made her skin crawl. "Got a gentleman downstairs who's taken quite a fancy to you. Says he'll pay double for first rights." Eliza May closed her eyes and tried to summon the strength that Sally insisted she possessed. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady and her voice didn't shake. "I'm ready," she lied. But as she prepared to follow Murphy downstairs to meet her fate, the sound of horses once again filled the street outside. Through the window, Sally gasped and pointed at the scene unfolding below. "It's him," she breathed, "the stranger from this afternoon, and he's not alone." Eliza May rushed to the window and saw that Sally was right. The dark-haired man had returned, but this time he was accompanied by half a dozen other riders, all of them armed and all of them looking like the kind of men who were accustomed to violence. Murphy had noticed them too. From downstairs came the sound of his voice, high-pitched with panic. "What in the hell is going on out there?" The stranger dismounted and walked toward the saloon doors with the same measured pace Eliza May had observed that afternoon. But there was something different about him now, something that spoke of barely controlled danger. He pushed through the swinging doors and disappeared into the saloon's interior. A moment later, his voice carried clearly through the building. "Murphy!" he called out. "We need to talk!" Ooh, the next few minutes passed in a confusion of raised voices and shuffling feet. Eliza May pressed her ear to the floor, trying to make out what was being said, but the words were too muffled to understand clearly. What she could hear was the tone, Murphy's voice growing increasingly desperate, the strangers remaining calm and implacable. Then, suddenly, the building fell silent. "What's happening?" one of the other girls whispered from the hallway. Before anyone could answer, they heard the sound of boots on the stairs. But these weren't Murphy's heavy, lumbering steps. These were lighter, more purposeful, and they were coming up quickly. The stranger appeared at the top of the stairs, his dark eyes scanning the hallway, until they found Eliza May's door. He was even more imposing up close, tall and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work and a face that had seen its share of trouble. But his eyes, when they met hers through the doorway, were kind. "Miss Harrison," he said, his voice gentle despite the authority it carried, "my name is Thomas Mackenzie. I'm here to take you away from this place." Chapter 2, The Price of Freedom, Final Chapter. The silence that followed Thomas Mackenzie's words stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Eliza May stared at him through the doorway, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the building could hear it. Behind her, Sally had gone completely still, barely daring to breathe. "I don't understand," Eliza May managed to whisper, her voice catching in her throat. "Take me away. But Murphy owns my debt. Jonas sold me to him." Thomas stepped into the small room, his presence immediately making the cramped space feel even smaller. Up close, she could see the details that distance had hidden. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of hard work, and the gun belt worn low on his hips with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to use the weapon it carried. "No man owns another human being," Thomas said quietly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "What your stepfather did was wrong, and what Murphy intended to do with you is worse. I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen." From downstairs came the sound of Murphy's voice, raised in angry protest. "You can't just come in here and take my property. I paid good money for that girl." "Your property?" Thomas's voice carried clearly down the stairs, and Eliza May could hear the steel beneath the calm tone. "We'll see about that." Sally grabbed Eliza May's arm, her fingers trembling. "He's really going to take you away from here," she whispered. "But how? Murphy won't just let you walk out that door." Thomas must have heard her because he turned his attention to Sally for the first time. "What's your name, miss?" "Sally Morrison," she replied, straightening her shoulders despite her obvious fear. "How long have you been here, Miss Morrison?" 2 years, Sally said, then added quietly, "But I came here willingly, thought I was getting a job as a barmaid. And now?" Sally's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Now I know better." Thomas nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Pack your things," he said. "Both of you." Eliza May felt her legs go weak. "Both of us?" "I'm not in the habit of leaving innocent women in places like this," Thomas replied. "Murphy's operation ends tonight." The sound of boots on the stairs interrupted any response she might have made. Murphy appeared in the doorway, his face flushed red with anger and exertion. Behind him were 2 of his men, both with their hands resting on their gun handles. "Now see here, Mackenzie," Murphy said, trying to inject some authority into his voice despite the obvious fear in his eyes. "You can't just come in here and steal my girls." I got legal papers on that one, he pointed at Eliza May, signed by her stepfather himself. Thomas turned to face Murphy, and even though he made no move toward his weapon, there was something in his posture that made Murphy's men take an involuntary step backward. Legal papers, Thomas repeated, his voice deceptively mild. You mean the papers that say you bought a human being like she was a horse or a cow? Now that ain't how it works, and you know it, Murphy blustered. The girl owes me money, her stepfather's debt. She's working it off, that's all. Working it off, Thomas said. In your brothel. That's a harsh word for what we do here, Murphy said. We provide companionship to lonely men, entertainment. It's a legitimate business. Thomas's laugh was like ice cracking. Is that what you call it when you force 17-year-old girls to service whoever has the price of admission? Murphy's face went from red to purple. You got no right to come in here and... I have every right, Thomas cut him off. You see, Murphy, I've been watching your operation for a while now, watching and waiting and gathering information, and what I've learned is that you're not just running a brothel. You're trafficking in human beings, forcing women to work against their will, and keeping them trapped here through violence and intimidation. You can't prove nothing, Murphy said, but his voice lacked conviction. Thomas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a warrant signed by Judge Patterson in Denver. It authorizes me to shut down your operation and arrest you for violation of the federal laws regarding human trafficking. Murphy stared at the paper as if it were a snake about to strike. Judge Patterson's got no jurisdiction here. Actually, he does, Thomas replied calmly. See, when your business crosses state lines, when you start bringing in women from Kansas and Nebraska and other territories, it becomes a federal matter, and I'm a federal marshal. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Eliza May felt her knees go weak with relief and shock. A federal marshal. He wasn't just some good Samaritan with a conscience. He was the law. Murphy's hand moved toward his gun, but before he could clear leather, Thomas had his own weapon drawn and pointed at Murphy's chest. The movement was so smooth, so practiced, that it seemed almost like magic. I wouldn't, Thomas said quietly. Your boys might get one of us, but I guarantee you won't live to see it. Murphy's hand slowly moved away from his gun. Behind him, his men looked uncertain, caught between their loyalty to their boss and their instinct for self-preservation. Now, Thomas continued, here's how this is going to work. You're going to tell all these women that they're free to go. Any of them that want to leave with me can do so. Any that want to stay and continue working for you, of their own free will, for fair wages, and without any threats or coercion, can do that too. And if I refuse, then I arrest you right now, and my men downstairs take this place apart, board by board, looking for evidence of your other crimes. And believe me, Murphy, we'll find plenty. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the small room. Finally, Murphy's shoulders sagged in defeat. You win, he said quietly. But don't think this is over. Men like you coming in here with your federal badges and your high-minded ideas about justice. You don't understand how things work out here. These women got nowhere else to go. They'll be back within a month, begging me to take them in. Maybe, Thomas said, holstering his weapon, but that'll be their choice to make. Murphy turned and stumped back down the stairs, his men following behind like whipped dogs. Thomas waited until their footsteps had faded before speaking again. Pack your things, he said to both women. We're leaving in 10 minutes. Eliza May's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely fold her few dresses. Sally moved more efficiently, clearly accustomed to traveling light. From the other rooms, they could hear voices as word spread among the other women about what was happening. Where will we go? Sally asked as she stuffed her belongings into a worn carpet bag. There's a town called Cedar Falls, about 50 miles north of here, Thomas replied. Good people there. The preacher's wife runs a boarding house for women who need a fresh start. She'll help you find work, real work. And what's the catch? Sally asked suspiciously. In my experience, men don't help women out of the goodness of their hearts. Thomas smiled for the first time since Eliza May had seen him, and the expression transformed his entire face. "No catch, Miss Morrison. Sometimes people do things just because they're the right thing to do." As they prepared to leave, Eliza May found herself thinking about Jonas. Despite everything he had done to her, he was still the only family she had left in the world. Part of her wondered if she should say goodbye, try to make him understand what his actions had cost both of them. "What about my stepfather?" she asked Thomas as they made their way down the stairs. "What about him? Will he be arrested too?" Thomas considered this for a moment. "That depends. Did he know what Murphy really intended when he made that deal?" Eliza May thought about the conversation she had overheard, remembered the way Jonas had asked about her running away, the fear in his voice when Murphy had outlined what her new life would entail. "Yes," she said quietly. "He knew. Then he'll face charges as well," Thomas said simply. "A man who sells another human being into slavery doesn't get to walk away from that, family or not." They emerged into the main room of the saloon to find it in chaos. Several of Murphy's regular customers were demanding to know what was happening, why their evening's entertainment was being interrupted. The other women who worked upstairs were clustered together near the bar, some crying, others talking in excited whispers about this unexpected turn of events. 3 of Thomas's men were stationed around the room, their rifles held casually but ready. They had the look of professional lawmen, calm, alert, and completely in control of the situation. "Ladies," Thomas called out, his voice carrying easily over the noise. "You all know what kind of work you've been doing here. You also know that some of you came here willingly and some didn't. I'm here to tell you that as of right now, you're all free to make your own choices about your lives." A woman named Beth, who couldn't have been more than 19, raised her hand tentatively. "What if we want to leave but don't have anywhere to go? Then we'll help you find somewhere," Thomas replied. "There are places for women who want to start over, people who will help you learn a trade, find honest work. And what if we want to stay?" This from Mabel, the oldest of the women. "This is the only life I've known for 10 years. I ain't educated, can't read or write. What else am I supposed to do?" Thomas nodded, his expression understanding. "Then you stay if that's really what you want, but it'll be your choice, and Murphy will treat you fair, pay you proper wages, let you come and go as you please, no more locked doors or threats." Murphy, who had been standing behind the bar nursing a whiskey, snorted derisively. "And who's going to make sure I keep to that bargain? You? You'll be gone by tomorrow." "I'll be checking back," Thomas said, "regularly. And if I hear that you've gone back to your old ways, I'll shut you down permanently and see you hang for it." The threat was delivered in the same calm tone he might have used to comment on the weather, but there was no doubt that he meant every word. In the end, 4 of the 7 women chose to leave with Thomas and his men. Besides Eliza May and Sally, there was Beth and a quiet girl named Mary, who couldn't have been much older than 16. The others, Mabel, a hard-faced woman called Dolores, and a redhead named Kate, decided to stay, though Thomas made sure they understood that the choice was truly theirs to make. As they prepared to mount the horses that Thomas's men had brought for them, Eliza May caught sight of a familiar figure stumbling down the main street. Jonas, probably coming to check on his investment, completely unaware that his world was about to come crashing down around him. "Marshal Mackenzie," she called out, pointing toward her stepfather. Thomas followed her gaze and nodded grimly. "Jim," he called to one of his men, "take Harrison into custody. Read him the charges." Eliza May watched as her stepfather was surrounded by federal marshals, saw the confusion and then the dawning horror on his face as he realized what was happening. For just a moment, she felt a pang of something that might have been pity. But then she remembered the sound of his voice as he agreed to sell her to Murphy, and the feeling passed. "You ready?" Thomas asked, swinging up onto his black stallion. Eliza May took one last look at Copper Creek, the dusty streets, the ramshackle buildings, the saloon where she had nearly lost everything that mattered about herself. Then she turned away and nudged her horse into motion. "I'm ready," she said. The ride to Cedar Falls took 3 days, during which Eliza May learned more about Thomas Mackenzie than she had ever expected to know about any man. He was 32 years old, originally from Virginia, and had been working as a federal marshal for almost 10 years. He had started tracking Murphy's operations 6 months earlier, after receiving reports from women who had escaped from similar establishments in other towns. "It's becoming a real problem," he explained, as they sat around the campfire on their second night out. "Men like Murphy prey on desperate women, girls with no family, no resources, no way to fight back. They promise them legitimate work, then trap them in situations they can't escape from." "How many places like Murphy's have you shut down?" Sally asked. "This was the 7th, Thomas replied. "But there are more out there, always more." Beth, who had barely spoken since they left Copper Creek, looked up from the small fire. "What happens to us now? I mean, really? You say there are places that will help us, but what if they're just more of the same? What if we're trading one kind of prison for another?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I won't lie to you and say it'll be easy. Starting over never is. But the place we're taking you to is run by good people, people who genuinely want to help. Mrs. Davidson, the preacher's wife I mentioned, she was in a situation similar to yours once. She understands what you've been through." "And after that?" Mary asked. It was the first time any of them had heard her speak. "After that, you make your own choices about your life," Thomas said. "Maybe you stay in Cedar Falls, maybe you move on to somewhere else. Maybe you learn a trade, maybe you get married, maybe you do something none of us can imagine right now. The point is, it'll be your choice to make." On the 3rd day, they crested a hill and saw Cedar Falls spread out in the valley below. It was larger than Copper Creek, more prosperous looking, with actual paved streets and buildings that appeared to have been constructed with some thought to permanence rather than mere convenience. "It's beautiful," Eliza May breathed, and it was. After the harsh, unforgiving landscape around Copper Creek, Cedar Falls looked like something out of a storybook. Mrs. Davidson turned out to be exactly what Thomas had promised. A kindly woman in her 50s with graying hair and eyes that held genuine warmth. She welcomed the 4 women into her boarding house without question, showing them to clean, comfortable rooms and promising them all the time they needed to figure out what they wanted to do with their lives. "The first thing," she told them over dinner that first evening, "is to rest. Really rest, not just your bodies, but your spirits. You've all been through terrible ordeals, and healing takes time." That night, lying in a real bed with clean sheets and a door that locked from the inside, Eliza May allowed herself to truly believe, for the first time since this nightmare had begun, that she might actually be safe. But it wasn't until the next morning that she realized Thomas was preparing to leave. She found him in the boarding house's small garden, checking his horse's gear and preparing for the road. The sight of him getting ready to ride away sent a jolt of panic through her that she didn't entirely understand. "You're leaving," she said, and it wasn't a question. He looked up from adjusting his saddle and nodded. "My work here is done. There are other places that need attention, other women who need help. Will I ever see you again?" The question came out before she could stop it, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. What was she to him, after all? Just another victim he had rescued, another case he had closed. She had no right to expect anything more from him. But Thomas stepped closer, his dark eyes searching her face. "Would you want to?" She found herself at a loss for words. The truth was, she barely knew this man. He had saved her from a horrible fate, yes, but that didn't mean she had any claim on his attention or his affections. And yet, there was something about him that drew her, something that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since her mother died. "I know this isn't the time or place for such conversations," Thomas said quietly. "You need time to heal, to figure out who you are when you're not fighting just to survive. But when you're ready, if you're ready, I'd like the chance to get to know you better. The real you, not the frightened girl I pulled out of Murphy's brothel." "And how would that work?" Eliza May asked. You're always traveling, always chasing down men like Murphy. I won't be doing this forever, Thomas replied. I've been thinking about settling down, finding a place to call home, maybe starting a ranch, something quiet and peaceful. With me? If you'll have me, he said simply. But only if that's what you want, not because you feel obligated or grateful. I want you to choose me because you want to, not because I'm the only option you have. Eliza May felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. When was the last time anyone had cared about what she wanted? When had anyone ever given her a real choice about her own life? How long? She asked. How long what? How long before you come back? Thomas smiled, and again she was struck by how the expression transformed his entire face. 6 months, he said. I've got 3 more operations to shut down, then I'm done. I'll come back here in 6 months, and if you want to see me, we'll talk about the future. If you don't, I'll respect that and leave you in peace. 6 months. It seemed like both an eternity and no time at all. I'll be here, she said quietly. You sure? I'm sure. He nodded and swung up into his saddle. For a moment he sat looking down at her, and she thought he might say something more. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat in a small salute and turned his horse toward the road. Eliza May watched him ride away until he disappeared over the hill, then stood in the garden for a long time, thinking about the future for the first time in months. The next 6 months passed more quickly than she would have thought possible. Mrs. Davidson helped her find work at the local seamstress shop, where her skill with a needle, taught to her by her mother years ago, quickly made her indispensable. She rented a small room above the shop and began to build something she had never had before, an independent life. Sally found work as a cook at the town's hotel and seemed to thrive in the structured environment. Beth apprenticed herself to the local midwife and discovered a talent for healing that surprised everyone, including herself. Mary, the quietest of the 4, found her voice working in the town's small school, helping to teach the younger children their letters. They remained friends, bound together by the shared experience of their rescue and their determination to build new lives for themselves. But gradually, they each found their own paths, their own reasons for getting up in the morning that had nothing to do with mere survival. Eliza May thought about Thomas often during those months. She wondered where he was, whether he was safe, whether he thought about her at all. She had no way of knowing if he would keep his promise to return, and as the 6-month mark approached, she found herself alternating between excitement and terror. What if he didn't come back? What if he had forgotten about her, moved on to someone else, decided that the quiet life he had spoken of wasn't what he wanted after all? What if he did come back and she disappointed him? What if the woman she had become during these months of freedom wasn't the woman he thought he was returning for? But on a crisp morning in early spring, exactly 6 months and 3 days after he had ridden away, she looked out the window of the seamstress shop and saw a familiar figure on a black horse riding down Cedar Falls Main Street. Her hands were shaking as she untied her apron and smoothed down her skirts. Mrs. Henderson, the seamstress, took one look at her face and shooed her toward the door. "Go on," she said with a knowing smile. "I can handle things here for a while." Thomas was waiting for her in the boarding house garden, standing in the same spot where they had said goodbye 6 months earlier. He looked older somehow, more weathered, and there was a new scar on his left hand that hadn't been there before. But his eyes were the same, kind and honest and full of quiet strength. "You came back," she said, and immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. "I said I would," he replied. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped you would," she admitted, "but I wasn't sure." They stood there for a moment, awkward as teenagers, each trying to read the other's face. Finally, Thomas spoke. "You look good," he said. "Happy, settled." "I am," Eliza May replied, and realized it was true. "For the first time in my life, I think I actually am happy." "I'm glad," Thomas said, and she could hear that he meant it. "You deserve to be happy." "What about you?" she asked. "Did you finish what you set out to do?" Thomas nodded. All 3 operations shut down, 17 women freed, 8 men arrested and convicted. I'm officially retired from federal law enforcement as of last week. And now I'd like to court you properly," he said, his formal words at odds with the nervous way he was fidgeting with his hat. "If you're willing. I know it's been 6 months, and maybe you've changed your mind, or met someone else, or—" "Thomas," she interrupted gently. "Yes, I haven't changed my mind." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. Really, she confirmed. "But I have conditions." His expression grew serious. "Name them." "I want to keep working," she said. "I like having my own money, my own independence. If we're going to build a life together, I want it to be as equals." "Agreed," Thomas said without hesitation. "And I want to be involved in whatever you do next. If you're going to start a ranch, I want to help run it. I don't want to be just a wife sitting at home while you make all the decisions." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Thomas replied. "I've seen what you're capable of, Eliza May. I'd be a fool not to want you as a full partner. And one more thing," she said, stepping closer to him. "I want you to promise me that you'll never lie to me, never try to protect me by keeping things from me. I've had enough of people making decisions about my life without consulting me." "I promise," Thomas said solemnly. "Complete honesty, always." "Then yes," Eliza May said, reaching up to touch his scarred cheek. "I would very much like you to court me properly." Thomas caught her hand in his and pressed it against his face. "I love you," he said quietly. "I know it's too soon to say that, but I do. I think I have since the moment I saw you standing in that window above Murphy's saloon, looking like you were ready to fight the whole world if you had to." "I love you too," she replied, and felt a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to trust a man again, but you've shown me that not all men are like Jonas or Murphy." "No," Thomas agreed. "Not all men are like that, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that some of us are worthy of your trust." They were married 3 months later in a simple ceremony at Cedar Falls Small Church. Sally, Beth, and Mary stood up as her bridesmaids, and Mrs. Davidson cried happy tears throughout the entire service. Thomas's fellow marshals came in from all over the territory to attend, and the celebration afterward lasted well into the night. A year later, they were settled on a small ranch outside Cedar Falls, raising cattle and horses and building the kind of life that Eliza May had never dared to dream about during those dark days in Copper Creek. Thomas proved to be exactly the kind of partner he had promised to be, respectful of her opinions, supportive of her independence, and unfailingly honest about everything from their finances to his feelings. They named their first child Sarah after Eliza May's mother, and their second a boy. They called James after Thomas's father. By the time their third child was born, another girl they named Hope, the ranch had grown prosperous enough to employ several other families, including Sally and her new husband, a gentleman named Robert, who had swept her off her feet during a visit to Cedar Falls. Sometimes, late at night when the children were asleep and she and Thomas sat on the porch of their comfortable home, Eliza May would think back to that terrible day when Jonas had sold her to Murphy. She would remember the fear, the despair, the absolute certainty that her life was over before it had really begun. And then she would look at Thomas, at their children, at the life they had built together, and she would marvel at how completely everything had changed. She had been saved, yes, but more than that, she had learned to save herself. She had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, found love she had never expected to experience, and built a future that was entirely her own choice. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas would ask on those nights, following her gaze out over their land. "Just everything," she would reply. "How different things turned out from what I expected. Better or worse? Better," she would say, taking his hand in hers. "So much better than I ever dared to hope." And it was true. Life had tested her in ways she wouldn't wish on anyone, but it had also given her gifts beyond measure. She had learned that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a quiet cowboy with kind eyes and a strong sense of justice. She had discovered that it's possible to build something beautiful from the ashes of something terrible. And most importantly, she had found out that she was capable of choosing her own path, no matter how dark the circumstances might seem. The girl who had cowered in that storage room behind Murphy's bar, listening to her stepfather sell her into slavery, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who had learned to trust in love without losing her independence, and who understood that sometimes the most important person you need to save is yourself. As the years passed and their children grew, Eliza May often told them the story of how she and their father had met. She didn't spare them the harsh details. She believed children should understand that the world could be cruel, but also that people could choose to be kind. She wanted them to know that no matter what challenges they might face in their own lives, they always had the power to choose how they would respond. The most important thing, she would tell them, is to never give up on yourself. No matter how dark things get, no matter how hopeless everything seems, there's always a choice to be made. You can choose to let the darkness win, or you can choose to fight for something better. And when her eldest daughter, Sarah, came to her at 16 with worries about her future, about whether she would ever find love or build a meaningful life, Eliza May took her hands and looked her in the eyes. "You are stronger than you know," she said, echoing the words Sally had spoken to her all those years ago, "and you have the power to write your own story. Don't let anyone else hold the pen." It was a lesson born from the hardest experience of her life, but it was also the most valuable gift she could give to the next generation. Because sometimes the greatest rescue is the one you give yourself. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone willing to stand beside you as you do it. The end.